Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're really delighted to be joined by a terrific triple threat, a great teacher, rigorous scholar, explainer of national security and military issues, Carla Martinez Machain, who is a professor at the University of Buffalo. Let me tell you a little bit about Carla. She is from Mexico, grew up there, attended Rice University as both an undergrad and graduate, got her doctorate there, worked for about a decade at Kansas State University, had a terrific career there, and then about 2 years ago, accepted a position at the University of Buffalo. Does really important work in the whole range of issues on national security and military affairs. She is a co-author of a book that came out several years ago by Oxford University Press called Beyond the Wire: U.S. Military Deployments and Host Country Public Opinion. We're going to talk about that a lot. She also writes in a way that the rest of us can really understand for the Washington Post. They have a blog called Monkey Cage, and also there's an online journal called Conversation, which also explains, military issues very well. I should say, I mean, the Carla's book for Oxford University Press is part of a series called Bridging the Gap, and it prides itself in making really complex public policy or academic issues understandable to the general public. So that's something Carla does really, really well. As I said, she's a terrific teacher. Carla and I happened to meet a couple weeks ago at a meeting of the International Studies Association, which was having its Midwest conference in St. Louis. We had a chance to talk for a little bit, and I immediately thought that she would be a terrific guest for this series. So she is joining us from her office in Buffalo, New York. So good morning, Carla.
Hi, good morning, John.
Well, let's talk about growing up in Mexico. I know you came from you grew up in Mexico City and also another town an hour or so away. Your father was an academic, also involved in international business and consulting, as I understood it. Talk about growing up and sort of the international focus you kind of immediately embraced in your kind of interests academically.
Yeah, that's right. So my dad is also a Rice PhD. So we got our PhDs from the same university. And my mom actually went to an international school in Mexico, which is the same school I attended. So I think I grew up always thinking about, international issues. My school was bilingual. I learned English from a very young age. And I think I always had the idea of, at least for university, studying abroad, which is what I did for my undergrad. I traveled internationally as a kid, did Model UN in high school, which really got me interested in this idea of thinking about international relations. And so I think that was always in the back of my mind for me.
Well, and as I understand it, your Model UN class went to The Hague, and you ended up watching a little bit of the Milosevic trial. I mean, talk about that experience.
Yeah, so that was, I think I was, probably like 17 or 18, and it was my senior year of high school. We did Model UN in The Hague. That's where they took us to it. And that's when the Milosevic trial was going on. And it was, as you know, it was public. So my friend and I, we decided to go and just watch it. And, it was a little surreal, even at the time. Even, when you're a teenager, you realize that this is this huge international issue, happening right before you. I think it was part of what shaped my interest in international relations, international security, all of that.
So when you went to Rice, which is in Houston or outside of Houston, you began, as I understand it, studying economics, and then you shifted to both economics and political science with a particular interest in international relations. Talk a little bit about just kind of your early years at Rice and the kind of the intellectual interests that you developed.
Oh yeah, Rice was fantastic. I mean, I still have this strong attachment to it. It was a great place to be an undergrad. It was a small university, but very research focused. So from very early on, you were talking to your professors about the research they did. And from day one, you understood, the academic pursuits there. So Yes, I actually started as an economics major. I think I originally wanted to go into finance or something like that. Um, and I ended up only taking an international relations class as an elective, because I kind of had that background with Model UN. I was like, this is interesting to me. And then I think I very early on realized that I liked the methods of economics. I liked econometrics. But the questions that I found most interesting were the international conflict questions. And then I think being at Rice and given the focus of the faculty there, I think I very early on also realized that I could study those questions about international conflict using those methods from econometrics. And that was really what suited me the most.
I saw you in an interview make a reference to a class, and it was a little unclear if it was undergrad or graduate. And I'm sure it had a more formal title. I think you referred to it as Bombs and Rockets. What was that class? And tell me about what kind of captivated you about it.
Yes, that was an undergraduate class, and it was taught by Rick Stoll, who eventually became my graduate advisor. And that was what all the undergrads called it. I don't even know what the real name of the class was, but it was essentially an international security class, which is funny because now it's the class I teach here at Buffalo. But it was issues of international security. I remember Rick Stoll. One of the things he would have us do would be simulate a nuclear attack on U.S. soil and kind of what the nuclear fallout of that would look like. And the lesson of the exercise was, to just show us how catastrophic it would be, right? That regardless of how it happened, it would just be catastrophic, and to really have us understand the impact of that. Um, but yeah, no, that was a class my friends and we all took it. We loved it. Rick Stoll is a fabulous teacher. So bombs and rockets, that's what we called it.
Carla, we lost you for a second there in terms of audio, but let's just sit tight. I think it'll come back. One thing I saw in this interview you did, there was also a reference to a fairly famous book, I think, in the literature called Bombing to Win by Bob Pape that came out in 1996. I've seen there was actually a retrospective essay, I guess it was this 25th anniversary. Talk a little bit about that book and why it was such a kind of a foundational book in this realm of studies.
Sure. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, it might be the office audio. Yeah, so that book I read it also as an undergrad. My friend and we both read it together and were fascinated again by the idea of studying coercive bombing, from a more scientific social science point of view. And also as an undergrad, I took a research seminar with Bill Reed, who is now at Maryland, and it was a quantitative research class for undergrads. And so that's when I decided to study aerial bombing from a quantitative perspective and kind of basing myself on Bob Pape's book. And that ended up being what led to my dissertation topic about the duration of aerial bombing campaigns, as well as their effectiveness, different strategies. And I was actually fortunate enough to meet Bob Pape later on. And a few years ago in 2020, he actually hosted me at U Chicago for my sabbatical semester there, which unfortunately was cut short by COVID. But he hosted me at his center, and he's wonderful, very welcoming. And so it was very nice. It was a very like full circle sort of thing to happen.
Carl, just kind of as an aside, I was looking at the Brookings Institution website for some other reason, and I saw that they were having an event in late November. It was a book conversation, and the book title was called Bombing to Provoke. And I assume that it was a play off the Pape book. I mean, has that been sort of I gather that that's a book that a lot of people have reacted to and continue to react to. Is that fair?
I think so. I think anyone who studies coercive aerial bombing, has read that book and references it, and whether they, agree with the conclusions, disagree with them, it has influenced all of us, I think, to a great degree.
Now, in terms of your PhD thesis, I guess I've just read some other essays you have written, and I'm assuming that there's kind of a through line where it seems that your general take is that aerial bombardment is an important strategy, but alone it probably doesn't often meet strategic objectives, and that it needs to be part of a larger strategy. Is that sort of the essence of how you see the issue?
Yes, yes, I think so. So I think that the dissertation was really thinking about, different ways of categorizing aerial strategies depending, specifically on what you're bombing and what your aims are. The one big article that I published from the dissertation really looked at the interaction of the aerial strategies with also having troops on the ground, right? And as you said, how the having boots on the ground can really help out the coercive effort, and it's harder to signal resolve with an air only campaign, right? So it can work in limited cases, but for broader aims, troops on the ground increases the probability of effectiveness.
And I think people oftentimes cite like the 1991 Gulf War as sort of this kind of almost kind of archetype of bringing these, the kind of a complex strategy to bear. Is that fair?
Yes, and also you actually, if you look at even Syria, right, that was a case where the U.S. did engage in air only campaigns, and for the very limited aim that it had in that case of decreasing the use of chemical weapons, it was effective, right? So I think when you have these limited aims, you can have an air only campaign, but again, for broader aims, coercive aims, that's where you need something more complex as well.
Right. Well, I want to kind of drill down on some of the academic interests you have because I think they're very interesting, and I think all of our audience would like to understand some of the concepts better. One of them is foreign policy analysis, and and I understand it is a school among several schools and maybe even one or two competing schools. Tell us what foreign policy analysis is at its essence.
Mhm. Yeah, so the way I think about foreign policy analysis as being different from, for example, just international relations broadly defined, is I think it focuses on the actors who make the policy, right? And so we can think of the actor as the individual or the state, but we're really thinking about the decision-making process that is happening. And, some people might focus on the psychology that behind the leader's decisions, or others might just think about the state as a whole and the menu of options that they have of foreign policies to achieve a given aim. But I do think that the difference is that it really focuses on that decision process as opposed to just thinking about things happening in the international system as you would more in international relations broadly defined.
Because I've heard of it described as kind of in opposition to or in contrast to the structuralist approach. Is that more, how would you describe that dichotomy?
Uh, I guess that's not exactly how I think it can just be thought about in different ways in terms of the level of analysis you're thinking about. I just see foreign policy analysis as actor focused,
Okay.
right? That's kind of how I think about it. It's actor focused.
Does it usually or necessarily have a strong quantitative component? Or is it maybe just a sort of a subsection of it that might have a heavy quantitative element?
I think it can be done qualitatively or quantitatively, or even with a mixed method approach. Um, I've seen people do it both ways and do it well. My focus tends to be more quantitative, um, but I also like to be in conversation with different methodological approaches as well.
Okay. Well, another area you have is called military civil, and I think, we can sort of grasp, in broad terms, but how do you understand that kind of subdiscipline?
Yes, and that's actually also a graduate class I teach, so that's great to be able to have that conversation with students. And well, I mean, I think a lot of that literature is basically focused on this kind of fundamental question that was, asked by Sam Huntington and many others about, how do you deal with this problem, I guess is one way to think about it, where you want a military that is strong enough to defend the state, but at the same time, you want them to be controlled by a civilian government, right? And really addressing that question, and just broadly thinking about how the military is going to be relating to a civilian government and the civilian population as well.
We had an event a year or two ago with Elliot Cohen, who's written a book called Supreme Command. And he argues that more than most of us kind of appreciate, really, really successful civilian leaders, and he would cite like Lincoln and Churchill as exemplars, are much more involved than people understand. I mean, particularly in the sense of just asking probing questions and just really making sure that they understand what the strategy is and really pressing their military leaders to explain it clearly. I mean, do you have a sense of the Cohen thesis? Is it something that you generally agree with?
Um, I've read a lot of Elliot Cohen's work. In fact, I was, before this conversation, I was telling you about this pedagogy workshop I attended, and he was one of the people who ran that pedagogy workshop in Basin Harbor a few years ago. And so, for that, I read a lot of his work, and yes, I agree that, having civilian leaders understand the military, the workings of the military, is part of what leads to stronger civilian control of the military.
Well, another area that you have an expertise in is referred to very simply as conflict. And I've also read you refer to conflict as a kind of a negotiation. Talk about conflict as you use the term.
Mhm. Yeah, so and I think that goes back to the tradition that I was trained in at Rice, as well as many of my other colleagues have been, where we think about kind of the rationalist approach to war. And I mean, a lot of this is based on the work of Jim Fearon and Powell and all of these different scholars who basically think about, when states find themselves in a crisis, meaning that the use of force is an option as a way to resolve a conflict, we're thinking of it as them bargaining, right? They want different outcomes, and it's a zero-sum game. And so they have to bargain with each other. If the bargain fails, they end up at war. But I also think that the war continues the bargaining, right? And I think Dan Ryder's book, How Wars End, really goes into that, right? So that even though we're still fighting, we're still going back and forth, deciding, I make demands, you either accept them or choose to continue fighting. And that's basically how I think broadly about conflict in the international system.
Great. I want to get to your research in a second, but I want to talk for a minute about your teaching. And I was looking at your website, and I smiled when I read a quote from a book from my youth, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Robert Pirsig. And you're talking about kind of the university as just this, less a physical place, as just kind of an idea of rational inquiry and examination. Tell us what inspired you to bring Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance into your discussion of teaching.
Well, I'm glad you like that book too, because I love that book. I think I read that in grad school, and I mean, just for fun, not for grad school. I read it and I was like, it blew my mind. And every class I teach, I always end it with that quote, because I think that after we've had this whole semester of students having to hear me go on about these theories and these cases and, stressing about exams and grades and all that, I kind of like to bring it back to kind of that core idea, right? That what we're doing in the university isn't about grades or titles, or that it really is about learning to reason. And I do think that that's something really nice about the social sciences. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine, very brilliant, who's a software engineer, and she was telling me, oh, in college, I took this class on critical thinking because I wanted to learn critical thinking. And I was kind of like, well, isn't that every college class? And she said, no, my other classes were just purely technical. And that actually, made me feel good about what we're doing in the social sciences, right? Sometimes we get these kind of existentialist moments, what are we doing here? But it really made me think about that, right? That we're teaching students how to think critically and go out into the world and be able to absorb information, process it, and be skeptical, ask questions, analyze what is going on around them. And I think it's making them better citizens of the world to really learn to think like that. And so I end with that quote because I want them to think it. Even if you forget the dates, the name of the theories, everything, the way of thinking is what I want you to take with you into the world.
In terms of your teaching at Buffalo and also your teaching at K-State, would it be a mix of both undergraduate and graduate? Or they tend to be lectures or seminar classes? I mean, what is sort of the range of teaching you've done, and what type of teaching is most enjoyable and stimulating and fun for you?
Yeah, I think ever since I've started, I've taught a mix of undergrad and grad classes. It's funny at K-State, my Kansas State, my grad class, it was about half military, half civilian. So half of them were military officers at Fort Leavenworth at the Army College there. And it was funny because when I started at K-State, I was 27. So most of my grad students were older than I was. But it was great. Speaking of the military and professional military education, it was a very interesting perspective that they brought to the classroom as, having been practitioners. And so my grad classes are always seminars. It's more of a Socratic method. I'm leading the discussion. They read academic articles and then we, tear them apart a little bit, discuss them in class. My undergrad classes have tended to be um, a mix of some lecturing, because I do think that there's value in that and having someone explain that to you. And I always like to include, some sort of interactive component, right? So it might be small group discussion sections. I love doing games and simulations in class. I think those are really good at, helping the students really understand those key concepts and process them well. And they have fun. Sometimes it's nice to get them out of their chairs and moving around. I've taken some pedagogy courses, for example, with Victor Asal, who's at Albany, and they're great. And they really teach you how to, apply these methods in the classroom.
Great. Well, let's talk about the book that you published with a couple co-authors several years ago called Beyond the Wire. And I actually saw, I don't know if this was an earlier draft of the book or maybe a paper, but initially the subtitle I saw was, which I wrote down, was U.S. military deployments and the diplomacy of defense. And I think actually in the book, it's U.S. military deployments and host country public opinion. Um, well, first of all, we might even broadly talk about the book. I know it was based on 3 years of surveys and I think 14 different countries. And I know you love data and field work. So maybe just talk about what you were looking to analyze, how you did it, and then also what you discovered.
No, absolutely. I think that, in a way, the book is a civil military relations book, but I think what we're looking at is the relations between the US military and then civilians in the host country that they're deployed to, right? So whether it's the elites or the population, and specifically, we were looking at cases in which the US military was there by consent, right? So not cases in which it was there as an invading force, but cases in which, for example, there's a US military base being hosted by somewhere like England or the Philippines, or wherever. And so the broad question that we were asking was, how is it that relations with the US military, interactions with the US military affect perceptions of the US as a whole, of the US military, and as well as, how then people react. Do they choose to protest? Are there differences in how different ethnic groups interact with the US military? We looked at crimes committed by the US military and how those affect relations with the host. So yeah, I do think of it in a way as a civil military relations book, as well as a foreign policy one, of course.
In terms of your field work, I mean, how did you find people to survey and to talk with? I mean, what was your method of finding a public that you could reach out to?
Mhm. So we basically had a two-pronged methodological approach. So on the one hand, we had these large-scale surveys that we did through two different survey firms, where basically each year we would survey 1,000 people in each country, right? So 14,000 people each year. Um, and so that was just the general population. And then we ourselves traveled to these different countries. Well, 2020, we had to do Zoom surveys, but that's a whole other thing. We traveled, and then for those interviews, we were focusing on elites, right? Because from the big surveys, we were getting the views of the general public, but we wanted to talk to host country government officials, civil society, also from the US side, right? Some of those service members themselves, as well as US diplomats. And so, it was a variety of methods that we used to reach out to them. But honestly, a lot of it was a lot of, cold emailing, hey, we're researchers from such and such universities. This is what we're doing. We'd like to talk to you. And, what we found was that once we showed up in country, people were very willing to talk to us. So, when we emailed them ahead of time to try and set up something, we got nothing. And so, for example, the first year we showed up in Panama and had no interviews scheduled, right? Because we wanted to look at a case where the US had been and then had left. So we went to Panama and we showed up and we had no interviews. And we were like, what are we going to do? But then once we were there and then we emailed these people and said, hey, we're here, we're sitting in a hotel, we'd like to come and talk to you. They started responding. And then once we would talk to someone, always at the end of the interview, we would ask them if they had any contacts of people who would be willing to talk to us. And they did. They usually would give us more contacts. That's how we ended up talking to a former president of Panama, because someone else we had interviewed gave us his contact information. We, emailed him. He invited us to his house, served us coffee, and it was great.
To the extent that you're able to generalize for the are, is the U.S. military, I mean, how do people react to them? Is the U.S. I mean, are they good ambassadors for the United States? Do they, and I'm sure different countries have different circumstances and they have the nature of their encounters are different. But to the extent that you can generalize, I mean, how is the U.S. military reacted to on the ground?
Yeah, so I think I would begin by saying that they actually end up doing a lot more public diplomacy than we realize, right? So a lot of people in these countries, this is their exposure to Americans, right? A service member in their country. And so we actually asked people about their contact with a US service member. Have you had personal contact? Or does someone someone in your network, have they have contact? And then in our analysis, we studied how that correlates with their views of the US military. And so in general, what we found was, the majority of the people we talked to have, somewhat positive views of the US military, right? And in particular, ones who have had contact with a service member are more likely to have positive views of the US military, but also a smaller proportion are who have contact have more negative views, right? So basically what we find is that having contact with service members pushes them away from neutrality, right? From saying, I don't know, I have no opinion. But the positive effect is bigger than the negative effect. So that's the good news, right? They're being pushed away from indifference, and the people who are being pushed away to the positive side, that's a bigger effect than the ones who are being pushed to the negative side.
Mm. No, I know you had several co-authors, and I guess as someone who's not really worked with co-authors before, how does that work? I mean, do you divide the project into like different segments that each person pursues, and then you come together and pull it all together, or is there overlap? Talk about just kind of the art of working with co-authors.
Yes, and I will say, especially for the book, we got along great. So there were four of us in the project. And the collaboration actually started with the most junior of them, Andy Stravers. He was actually still a student. He was still a grad student when we started the project. And he wanted to apply for a grant. And he just kind of cold emailed, some of us and was like, hey, you guys want to work on this project together? We were like, sure, why not? We applied for a grant, we got one. And I knew two of them, the Michaels, Alan and Flynn. Not that Michael Flynn. This is another Michael Flynn, not the famous one. And so I knew them, kind of from just the general network of conferences because we did similar work. Michael Flynn and I ended up working together at K-State for a while. And, it was we all kind of did a bit of everything. It wasn't just that we would just split up the project. You take this chapter, I take that one. We kind of had our little pet projects within it. But overall, it would be like someone would write a draft of something and then someone would go over it and fix it. Someone would write some survey questions. Someone else would add some. We really all were involved in every part of it. And it worked out really nicely. I'd say we even traveled together to all these different countries to do field work and, had meals together, did all these. I think the only thing that we had conflict over was the cover of the book. We all had different ideas of what it should look like. But I think that's a very, minor thing. And it was a great team to work with.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about this series, Bridging the Gap, because it seems to me that it's a really important endeavor to to bring together the kind of world of policymakers and scholars, because oftentimes, particularly in the realm of political science, they don't always speak the same language, and there is this gap that is frustrating. So talk about this series and just, what contribution you're hoping to make to this broader effort.
Absolutely. And I think I first became aware of it because I actually participated in the workshop that the Bridging the Gap project, run from American University, does for faculty. They have one for grad students and then one for faculty members. And I participated in the faculty members one. And I found that fascinating. I learned so much. They taught us, how to write blog posts, how to communicate during interviews, all of these types of things. And it really emphasized to me the importance of, not just asking policy relevant research questions, but also knowing how to communicate those results. And I think especially for me as a quantitatively focused scholar, that I thought was important because I do think there can be this perception that, this, I don't know, skepticism of quantitative scholarship. Like, oh, it's not policy relevant. It's just people playing with numbers and trying to do, show offy things that don't really matter. And I don't think that, right? I think that, these methods, just the same as qualitative ones, can be informative, but you have to know how to present them, right? And so, for example, for the book, we focused a lot on the graphics, right? So rather than present a regression table with a bunch of numbers that someone is going to flip right through, how do we present, a graph, right? That shows, for example, the effect of contact on views of the US military in a way that, someone who knows about policy, who has some basic numeracy skills can read it, but doesn't have to be, have taken, 5 classes in statistics to understand. And so I think that was very important to us. How do we present quantitative statistical results in a way that is easy to consume for a broader audience?
Right. Well, you had mentioned the funders, and I think this was partly funded by the Minerva project that the Department of Defense has. And it strikes me, I've just read a little bit about it, quite an intriguing effort in which, I mean, the Department of Defense, they want to know what people think about them. I mean, that probably oversimplifies it, but tell us a little bit about what this project is.
Yes, so it's basically the Department of Defense funding through the Minerva Initiative basic science, right? So it's great because it doesn't have to be applied. It is just basic social science. And it was great because, once you get the grant, they tell you, we're not going to help you with a project. We're not helping you, get in contact with military people you want to interview or anything, but also they don't interfere, right? Which is, to me is very important. I think, some people have maybe criticized as they're like, oh, you guys are funded by the military. You must be shills for the US military. It's like, no, they gave us the money, and then whatever the results show, the results show that they're not involved in any way. That the people who choose the awardees of the grant are other social scientists. That, it's just the same as if the money were coming from the National Science Foundation, right? And I think we are asking policy relevant questions that are relevant for the U.S. military, but it's a purely academic endeavor. There's no interference, and I can tell you, I was there. We got the results we had, and some of those results were that people do protest against the U.S. military, and that's the U.S. military does commit crimes when it's abroad, and that is what it is, and I think it's important, right? And yeah, it was great working with Minerva.
Right. Well, let's talk kind of broadly about the U.S. military. And I mean, the pervasiveness of the military is quite striking. And there was a book written about it maybe 8 or 10 years ago by Rosa Brooks called How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything. And her point was just the pervasiveness of the military. And she talks about, the Pentagon, hosting peace concerts in Africa and distributing soccer balls with anti-extremist slogans in Iraq and training judges in Afghanistan. And I guess, a couple questions flow from that. I mean, just the pervasiveness of the military. I mean, is it being asked to do things that it probably shouldn't be doing? I mean, and also by it being asked, is it diminishing the role of like the State Department or USAID? Talk about, if you can, just the kind of the pervasiveness of the military, and particularly you, I'm sure you came across it in your study about deployments, about just the many, many things they are doing.
Mhm. No, and I think when we were doing field work, we would interview people also at state as well as people who are there from the military deployed. And I think you're right that there are certain jobs that are made for diplomats, right? That the military, they do engage in some public diplomacy, whether they want to or not, by being there. But diplomats are going to have, for example, country expertise, right? Really expertise on the culture, the government system of a country that the military doesn't, and shouldn't be expected to have, right? Someone who is being deployed to all these different places can't have that, language expertise, that cultural expertise that the State Department does. And so I do think it's important to not de-emphasize the State Department, the diplomats, their expertise, and focus only on the military. But that said, the military, simply by being in all these different countries, is engaging in public diplomacy, whether they want to or not, right? Every time a service member goes and does their shopping at the local supermarket, they're representing the US, whether they want to or not. And I do think that in those cases, it is useful to have them, understand that and be willing, to at least try to learn the language, communicate with locals, a little bit of the culture, what's going on. And a lot of them do, right? And so from these interviews we held, they really, would tell us, that they were interested in meeting the locals, that most of their interactions were positive ones. And yeah, a lot of that was going on.
And I think in some projects, the military is actually specifically asked or charged to train um, host country militaries, particularly in areas such as human rights. And I know you've done some research there. By and large, to the extent that you can generalize, is the U.S. military effective in kind of training an ethos of human rights respect?
Um, like everything, it depends, right? It definitely, the focus on human rights has increased in recent years, which is good, right? Whether it is actually having an effect, you know, on the ground, on security forces, I think, it varies, right? It really, you know, there's some countries in which it does, some in which it doesn't, and some of it also has to do with, you know, in that host country, how much that education continues to be emphasized as well, right? It can't just be a one-off thing where you take a course with the U.S. military and suddenly, magically you respect human rights. But I think that it's a step in the right direction to emphasize it more. I'm actually working on a project right now looking at the case of Turkey with a co-author, where we're not looking so much at human rights, but at kind of influence that is being built at that kind of middle level of military to military influence, and there seems to be something there. So I'm very interested to see where that goes next.
Right. I saw an article just, I think it was last week in the Atlantic, and it was meant to provoke, and it was called "Bring Back the War Department," and it was written by a journalist by the name of Elliot Ackerman, and he talks about his basic thesis is, that what became the Department of Defense was created, I think, in 1949. And I'm going to read a sentence or two and have you kind of react to it. He says, by changing the department's name, Congress also endorsed an expansionist view of the new department's mission. For the U.S. military, the 77 years that followed the act's passage ushered in an unprecedented nation building and humanitarian missions all over the world. He goes on to say, this is where he gets provocative, since the creation of the Defense Department, the United States has never won a major war. Muddled outcomes such as those in Korea and Iraq are the closest thing it might claim to success. I wonder if you saw the article, and it just maybe the broader notion that, I guess, playing off what we've been talking about, that the Defense Department has become involved in so many activities that its sort of central job as a warfighting entity has been diluted.
Well, I didn't read the article, so just kind of going. I mean, I think the issue here is that what is also happening, and what has also happened since 1949, is that the U.S. has become the world hegemon, right? And I don't think it's what the U.S. is doing in the international system is not just about the Defense Department not being the War Department anymore. It's that the U.S. is the hegemon, and so when you have a country in the international system that is the hegemon, that is the most powerful country by a lot, it's going to be doing the sort of things like humanitarian interventions, because everything that's happening in the world is happening in the US's sphere of influence, because the world is its sphere of influence, right? And I think that's what's happening, and I don't think it's about the institution. I think it's about the level of power that the US has in the international system right now.
Right, great. Well, Carl, let's talk a little bit about your writing, for more, for layer audiences. And I know, like, for the Post, you've written some terrific essays. Um, and in fact, I read one that you wrote, I think it was in 2018 or 19, about the US bombing campaign in Syria. And so maybe talk, I wonder if you could talk about just, the sort of challenge of writing, for the Post and also the conversation. And then also, I mean, now that we have you here to talk a little bit about your reflections on what's happening in Syria. And I'm wondering, for people who like read the New York Times, we've always, or at least I assumed, that Assad had lost and, that was over with. And then all of a sudden it's like, what? And I'm wondering for specialists, if the surprise and shock was as profound as it was for those of us who are, following it maybe more superficially.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll start with the writing. I enjoy it very much. I think before I thought I wanted to go into finance, I wanted to be a writer. I've gone through all the things. And so I enjoy working on my writing, on really focusing on, the rhetorical grammar of it. These little things, I enjoy them very much. And so I think writing, for broader non-academic audiences is great. You really have to do things, like focus on the length of your sentences, right? I think as an academic, we're trained to be very wordy, right? We qualify everything we say, so our sentences end up being this long. And I think you have to work on that, like being punchier, really focusing on getting the point through. But again, I am a big believer that what we're doing as academics should be translated to a broader population. The whole thing about the university and the continuing of reason, right? So I've enjoyed doing that, and that piece about Syria for years ago, which I co-authored with Susan Allen, who's also one of my academic co-authors. Yeah, I liked doing that, and as you mentioned, we're all thinking about Syria right now. I actually have an ongoing project with another co-author about those aerial bombing campaigns by the U.S. and its allies, or the threat of bombing in Syria as well. And we argue in the paper that we actually do think they were effective in reducing the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And I mean, like you said, I was somewhat surprised as well by the events in the last few days in Syria. But I also do think that if once we actually stop and think about it, it made sense, right? That once the Assad regime did not have as much support um, from Russia or from Iran, that they just were not able to stand on their own, and that the rebels really did have this window of opportunity to overthrow the regime.
I read another article that you wrote actually earlier this year about Niger and the U.S. Bases there, and in some sense, its competition with China. And the one thing, I mean, it was an interesting little insight, little only in the sense it was kind of a micro study of the competition between China and the U.S. for these bases. So talk about that. And also, I was intrigued when you talked about these bases, you referred to them as drone bases. And I wonder how many, I mean, tell us about, what actually is a drone base and how many does the US have? And any broader comments you want to make about drones? They seem to be in the news these days. So,
Oh, yeah. Well, well, that's what happens when, the US is no longer the only one producing them, right? Um, no, I think, well, so in terms of competition, yes, I think, uh, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, Russia has basically, turned what used to be, the Wagner Group now into Africa Corps, right? And so they're doing this job of training African militaries, and a lot of that training comes without the, what we were just talking about, the strings attached that U.S. military training would have, which is, a focus on human rights and democracy, civilian control of the military, all that. And so when they can get that from the Russians, in many cases, they're doing that, right? They're taking that as opposed to from the US. And so it's a competitive environment. Like you said, also China, right? It's competing in terms of aid projects, right? And more recently, also having more military bases abroad. And, you know, a, a drone base, right? A base from which you operate drones. And in some of these African cases, to target extremist terrorist groups, right? You want a drone base nearby that you can fly them out, especially to do reconnaissance on them. Ideally, you want the base to be somewhere nearby where you can operate the drones from. And so, losing them is problematic in terms of anti-terrorism, counterterrorism efforts from the U.S.
Carla, has any of your research, I mean, obviously the kind of explosion in artificial intelligence has been commented in all aspects of, life. And, you read articles about just how potentially important and ominous, AI will be in military affairs. Is that something that you've looked at in your scholarship at all?
I don't think AI specifically, but I do think that in this broader question of influence, right, and competition for influence between the US and, Russia, China, I think that that's somewhere where AI can play a huge role, right? So, for example, in terms of, information campaigns, misinformation, disinformation, that's something that the Russians have known to exploit, right, when they're trying to influence outcomes in other countries. And so I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that in that competition for influence between the US and its rivals.
I want to talk for a second about the International Studies Association. I attended the conference where I met you, and you actually had won a very prestigious award the previous year. But I was struck, went to this conference just at the suggestion of a colleague who said, I'm working on a class, and to help me kind of fine tune that. But so it was interesting to kind of walk into this conference in which it seemed as much a community as it was a conference, and attended the general meeting, and it was clear that people had been, together for 20 years and so forth. Talk about the group was ISA Midwest. Talk about it, and sort of how it has shaped your career and continues to shape your scholarship.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, broadly the bigger organization, the International Studies Association, is one that I've been involved with for many years since I was a grad student. But I think it was when I got my first job at Kansas State that one of my colleagues said, "Hey, you should check out this smaller regional conference. It's in St. Louis. We can drive to it. It's great." And so I went then, and I did. I found a great community there. I think there's a lot of people. I mean, there's different methodological approaches there, but a lot of people do quantitative political science. There's a lot of foreign policy analysis people there as well, and it's a very friendly environment. I think it's a place where you get, good feedback, that they'll tell you what you need to do with your work, but it's always in a very collegial tone, and then you can always go have a drink, alcoholic or not, with people, and keep chatting. It's a community feeling, and I think what is a testament to that is that a lot of the people who are no longer in the Midwest, like myself, keep going to this same conference because they really feel a part of that community.
Great. Well, finally, Carl, one thing I want to ask is, I mean, you're obviously involved in some really grave and intense subject areas, some important disciplines, and yet there's sort of a lightness in your spirit. And I saw the a presentation you gave at the ISA. You sent me the slide deck, and some very serious analytical work, but also photographs of Dolly Parton and Whitney Houston and Taylor Swift. Um, Talk about that. I mean, did you make sort of a conscious effort to try to bring kind of the fun and light aspects of life into these heavier subjects?
I do. I mean, and it's not to make light of heavy subjects, but it is to kind of, as a person, kind of keep a little bit of your personality and your interests. And I do think that, as a woman in security, which has been a very male dominated field, I always feel like it's important, to present myself, in the way I am authentically, right? And that can mean, I really enjoy Whitney Houston, Dolly Parton, and Taylor Swift, right? And so, to really, show that we as academics are, you know, also fun people sometimes. I like to highlight that, especially now that I'm, older, and as a way to show that to younger scholars as well.
Great. Well, final question on your work. I heard you talking in an interview where you said you tend to have a sort of your most productive time sort of in the morning, and then later in the evening, and there's maybe in the mid-afternoon you're a little less productive. Talk a little bit about how you go about your sort of writing and research, and just the way you kind of structure your days.
Yeah, it's funny because I was actually just talking about this with one of my colleagues, right? Like, kind of just knowing that, when writing, academic work, it's not just, divine inspiration and my ideas are so wonderful and they must get on the page. It really is about, having a routine, having a work ethic, and just sitting down and getting the writing done. And some of that is understanding, you as an individual, how it works. And so, I think I have figured out when are my most productive hours of the day, and I schedule my day so that I can write during those hours. I and so I will work out in the middle of the afternoon because that is when I'm, like I told you, I'm just feeling lazy, and so I'm like, go work out now. It's fine. Maybe do your grocery shopping. and then, leave your most productive hours protected to focus on the writing and the research and that as well.
Right. Well, final question. I know you've mentioned several times, you have projects with co-authors. I mean, as you look for the next year or so, I mean, what are the projects that you're most eager to kind of plunge into?
Yeah, so I think as I was telling you before this, I think the next thing I really want to look at, and this is with some of my co-authors, is to look at basis comparatively. So really focus on that great power competition between the US and mostly China, maybe a little bit of Russia as well. And we're looking to get some funding to go and do some surveys, do some fieldwork in countries where China either has a military presence or has expressed a preference for it. And, really to think about whether the conclusions we've drawn from this work on basing, are they about bases in general, or are they about US bases, right? And what is the difference once you look at bases or even just deployments from another major power? And so really taking a comparative focus on that is something I'm really excited about.
Okay, this is the final question. What is it like for a Mexican someone who grew up in Mexico to live in Buffalo?
Ah, I joke that this is all part of my master plan to make it to Canada because, I grew up in Mexico City, went to Houston for school, first job at Kansas, and now I'm in Buffalo. So, at least it's been gradual. It wasn't going, straight from nice mild weather to the snow. But I do think you have to embrace winter. You can't, you have to learn to love it, and I think I like snowshoeing. I go running in the snow. I go full in on winter, and you have to love it, right? Otherwise you're going to be unhappy.
Okay. Well, you are a hearty soul, Carla. So, well, thank you so much for really a terrific conversation and your important work. I look forward to continuing to follow it and hope to attend another ISA conference and see you there and look forward to a presentation that you might give at ISA.
No, thank you, John. This is really fun, and I do hope to see you again at ISA Midwest because that was a fun chat that we had there.
Yeah, St. Louis is nearby, so look forward to that. So, thank you so much, Carla.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to all you for watching another edition of our series. We will have this conversation with Carla, a video of it on our website in the coming days. Please share it with family and friends. And thanks for supporting the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute, keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much.